Welcome to this presentation on accessibility. This week we have two parts to videos. The first is just a review of the foundations of universal design for learning, as well as the basic elements of accessibility. And then part two, the video will cover how we can apply accessibility, particularly in PowerPoint, because the principles for applying it in PowerPoint will then transfer over to other programs and other types of design. So to start with, just for a review about accessibility and universal design for learning, this is a very common image that's often used to demonstrate the difference between equality and equity. So you say if everything's equal, then some people have a disadvantage. So we have to give extra supports to some people, and that helps them to be able to see like the rest of us. This image is actually criticized sometimes because it's a deficit perspective on equity. The reason these characters here need a boost is because of something wrong with them. They're shorter. When really, maybe what's wrong is not with them, it's that this fence was built for this person here. And so people have created this version where they show that maybe the problem is not necessarily the person's height, but it's the change in the fence, and it's that the systems, the underlying systems, are uneven and they don't start on an even playing field. And so that helps to address some of the deficit perspectives on equity. So now we're going to talk about how this might come into play in a different way with universal design. So you see, it used to be that wheelchairs going across a curb was very challenging. In 1945, in Kalamazoo, Michigan, they created the first curb cut. And that's when our curb slants down to help wheelchairs and others come down off the curb. It was partly in response to a lot of World War II veterans that needed to be in wheelchairs. And so it was trying to accommodate them. This curb here was a barrier to their ability to get around. Well, what you can see here is this is an updated image of the equity and equality. And it says, instead of providing boosts here, maybe we can just remove the barrier for everyone. We can take away that curb for everyone, and then everyone will be able to see the building or the baseball game or whatever it is. And this is kind of what happened when they started creating curb cuts where the curb comes down. It actually benefited more than just people in wheelchairs. It benefited people who were pushing strollers or who were rolling suitcases. And so it built on this idea of universal design for learning, that if we can make design accessible for some, it helps making design accessible for everyone in society. So here's some architecture examples and some landscaping examples of some changes in a structure that ended up helping a lot of different people. There's some tech examples, for example, captions on TV shows and on videos originally were created for the hard of hearing, but it ended up helping a lot of other people too. If you're watching TV in bed and you don't want to wake up your spouse. I was at a movie in the park last night and they had captions on, which was good because part of the time you couldn't hear it very well. It helps language learners. Another example is when you have speech to text and text to speech. Originally, we needed speech to text for people who didn't have the dexterity or ability to type in a keyboard. But it turns out that technology ended up being very useful for things like Alexa and Google Assistant and Siri, and for a lot of different reasons. We appreciate the speech to text. It also helps with transcriptions and such. So by trying to create technologies that support certain groups of people, we can actually be making things more accessible for everyone. And this gets us to accessibility. When you are designing instructional materials, it's important to think in terms of accessibility. What can I do to make this accessible to a lot of different groups of people? Remembering that when you make it accessible for one person, it's probably also going to help other people. And so they're called Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's a whole long book document the list what you can do to make web content accessible to a lot of different people with different abilities. And there's four main principles of this accessibility. It needs to be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. So I'm going to just break these down briefly. Perceivable, it means that even if I can't see well or I can't hear well, there are alternatives that help me perceive the information. So this could be captions, this could be text alternatives. When we have images on a website or even on slides, we want to have an alternate text because some people access websites as well as slides through a screen reader. And when a screen reader gets to a picture, it needs to know what to say and whether or not to explain that picture. So that goes with perceivable. Also under perceivable is that distinguishable, like when we talked about having colors that will not cause problems for colorblind people, that goes along with perceivable. Operable is the physical operability and the navigation of a web page or other document. So we're thinking some people might only be using a keyboard. Can we make it accessible for them? Some people might have seizures or physical reactions if we put a lot of blinking lights. So we want to make sure we don't do that. Some people might be adding input through either like a speech to text, or they might have some type of other input device that they're using. So we want to make sure that what we design is accessible by them as well. Understandable goes towards making sure that things are readable, making sure that different users can know what to do even if they speak different languages, or they might have ADD or ADHD or be on the autism spectrum, or just process information differently. And so when we want things to be readable, we want things to be predictable, where we know what's going to happen when we click somewhere. And we want to make sure that people can understand when they make errors, which we talked about a little bit last week. And finally, there's robust. And that means we want it to be compatible with a lot of different devices. So this includes mobile and computer, desktop, and tablets. It includes being able to work in different operating systems and browsers. And it also includes making sure that and it also includes making sure that it's adaptable with different accessible devices like screen readers or other tools, that it'll be supportive of assistive devices. And it also means that we need to make sure that what we create is accessible through assistive devices. So those are the four elements of accessibility. In the next video, I'm just going to walk through how we can create accessible PowerPoints because the same principles apply elsewhere.